Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. All right, so today's topic is Love in an Elevator, all about workplace romance.
That's right. Oh, my goodness. And that is actually the tamest title that we, for this podcast episode. We did a little bit of market research and went out and asked some folks out there what we should title a podcast episode about workplace romance, and got some pretty interesting responses, didn't we?
Yeah, and when we said we did a survey, we just texted our friends that are weird. Special thanks to Jordan from Washington D.C. For his prolific submissions, all of which were stuff we couldn't talk about on this podcast,
but gave us a tremendous laugh when we were looking at them. That's for sure.
Yeah, that guy should write for a Will Ferrell movie, like Old School Part 4 or something. But
I can see it.
Yeah, Ben. So, what are we going to talk about today in the episode?
Right. So we broke this into a couple pieces, and we're going to talk about different types of workplace romances and how they form. We're going to talk about some of the impacts that these have on individuals, teams, and broader organization. And we're going to try to provide some implications, some things, maybe what we should do and maybe should not do with regard to this entire topic.
So we're drawing from a nice summary in the Encyclopedia of Industrial and Organizational Psychology written by Charles Pearce, Pierce, from the University of Memphis, and also a good article in the MIT Sloan Management Review by John Pearce. That's a Pearce. Of Villanova University. So yes. Good stuff from those guys. But Ben, we had some pauses on doing this episode.
We did. And it's basically because both of us come from a background and just a kind of a mindset where, this is workplace romance. We're like, no, horrible idea, right? And, part of this is because we're also in the military and there are some fairly strong norms and rules around this in the military, it's interesting though, when I was thinking more about this after we did some preparation for this episode, I realized that, so I met my wife in undergrad, but we were actually kind of brought together because we were both resident assistants. We were both kind of laying down the law in the dorms. And so we were kind of working together, and so here I am thinking, we always a bad idea or whatever, and in a little way, not kind of the truest sense of the phrase workplace romance.
Justify
right?
It however you want.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll explain it away to myself, but I would say it wasn't truly a workplace romance, but it did bring us together, right? And here we are. A decade and a half later, actually more than that, but all is good. So, the thing is that this whole topic of workplace romance and this reality, it's unavoidable, kind of in the broader workplace context. It happens,
Yeah, it's just it's so rife with risk, but let's be honest about the workplace now. And it's going to happen. It's just like fraternization happens. All this stuff just happens somehow. So, in a survey by Career Builder back in 2009, 40% of respondents revealed that they have dated a coworker, with 18% indicating two or more, relationships. Guess they didn't learn the first time. and then there's 12% on the sidelines that really wanted a coworker type relationship.
Interesting. Right. So I think that indicates, at least, I don't know how scientific that survey was, but I think it does indicate at least that this is not an uncommon thing. It's not that most people are doing this, but it's definitely something that is not unusual. And it's also, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, I think, later in the episode, but we spend so much of our working time awake time at work. It's bound to happen. And, it's not necessarily terrible, but it's just risky, and you got to navigate these things appropriately. So maybe let's just jump in and talk a little bit about what are some of these different types of workplace romances, and we can talk a little bit then about how they form and develop.
Right. So there are five main types of workplace romance. And so I guess let's just go through the list. And this is the stuff that we pulled from the Encyclopedia of Industrial and Organizational Psych article by Charles Pearce. So the first one's companionate. So both employees are genuinely in love with one another and seeking long-term companion or spouse.
Aww.
Ah. So, and, the researchers will divide this stuff up. They'll figure out, what it is. And so I guess this is probably one of the better motivated ones. Hey, you really like the person and you're looking for that long-term companion or whatever. So what's the second one, Ben?
Yeah. So number 2 is the passionate workplace romance. And this is where both employees are genuinely in love with one another and are seeking adventure, ego, satisfaction, excitement, sexual gratification, right? So it's perhaps a little bit different than the seeking of the long-term companion or spouse.
Right. And if you're looking for ego satisfaction in a relationship, you'll have a lot of good company, but probably not the most successful longevity. So
no,
totally recommend you check some better marriage books or something on that stuff. The third one is fling. So both employees are seeking adventure, ego satisfaction, excitement, and sexual gratification. So
yeah. It's so funny because just you and I, just based on kind of who we are and our upbringings and so forth, it's a very foreign concept to us. But I am aware that this happens apparently.
Right. So flings are just they're just pure sexual shenanigans is what At passionate, you still want the sexual shenanigans, but you actually love the person. And then this is what I didn't get about the first one, companion. I guess, maybe you're just buddies that want to do life and gardening together, So, all right, the fourth one, mutual user. Go ahead, Ben.
Right. So the mutual user, this is where we start getting into, I think, the different motivations for the relationship. And this is where both employees are seeking advancement, financial rewards, increased vacation time, lighter workloads, power, security, other types of job-related benefits and resources. So they're trying to get something job-related out of the relationship, and they're both doing that, as part of this workplace romance. So that's another category.
Yeah, I just see this sometimes. Maybe you've got people that are peer managers, and they're also busy, but they're also sleeping together. And they're also playing office politics, but they both know. I guess this might be like one of those kind of power ethical flings. I don't know if you could call it that, but these are people that are moving on up using every means possible, and I guess having some shenanigans as part of it for fun.
Well, and the thing is here is that it's mutual. So both employees are seeking to get something career related out of it. Versus the fifth one, which is utilitarian, where one person is seeking that, right? So one person is seeking the career-related benefits, whereas the other person is maybe seeking adventure, satisfaction, excitement, all that kind of stuff. So mutual user, both are kind of trying to get ahead in the workplace as well through the relationship. Utilitarian, one person is, the other person isn't.
Or could just be called banging the boss, right?
I suppose that could be one way to describe it, right?
Some more survey here. So Career Builder also said 1/3 of people had dated a superior. And of those, 42% had dated their boss. So we want to talk about stereotypes. It does happen, right?
Yeah, it does.
People are people. So anyway, don't recommend any of these ones except maybe the companionate one. But let's talk about how this forms in the workplace.
Sure. So it's not unreasonable to see how this happens, because romance can develop out of things like repeated exposure. At work you are exposed to the same people over and over again. Um, Interpersonal attraction, love, emotion, attitudes, maybe some sort of social exchange where you're helping each other with different things, and maybe some sort of group dynamics. You're working together on things. And so, these types of these are all like pieces of the recipe, so to speak, that go into creating a situation in which it's more likely for workplace romance to develop. Some of the research on this suggests that there are a couple different what we call antecedents or predictors, factors that make this more likely. So things like just being in proximity with each other, physically, also functionally. So you're doing similar things, working together on things. Repeated social interactions makes total sense. Having similar work and non-work related attitudes. You got to be attracted to each other, right? So mutual attraction. And then favorability of attitudes towards workplace romance. So if you both kind of think like this is okay, like that's going to, make it more likely that it'll happen. If one person is like, I never date anyone at work or whatever, then it probably won't. And also a little bit of job autonomy. So people, who have a little bit of discretion over how they do their work, can also play into this, kind of this recipe, that these ingredients, so to speak, that create workplace romance.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, what was that MTV show where they get a big mansion, that they give college kids nothing to do, tons of booze, ta-da,
I think that describes like every reality show.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't actually watch them.
I don't either.
But they're gonna hook up, right?
Mhm.
That's what happens. Now, if you take people and put them in jobs where they're working 80, 100 hours a week, and they have no outside activities, and they're stuck together, that's a recipe for, at least attraction,
Right. Well, and the thing is that a number of those things that I mentioned as potential predictors or antecedents, so to speak, of workplace romance are actually things that a number of them are things that you kind of want, in terms of an organization. You want people to be able to work with each other in proximity. That can help with teamwork. You want people to have repeated social interactions so they can make sense of what's going on and problem solve and so forth. And you want people to have job autonomy. Like, so, in a sense, if you're running an organization well, you're actually creating some of these situations in which it could be more likely.
Yeah, when I was in undergrad, I was in some, musical theater type things,
Mm-hmm.
and people would feel the romance backstage and stuff. And so they'd like, we should go out. And I remember it a couple times. I was like, actually, these aren't real feelings, right? This is the magic of theater. This is the magic of, working on this production. And it's okay to have some of those feelings. That you can't actually control your feelings, but your actions, at least if you're a disciplined individual, are your domain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, don't beat yourself up. Don't necessarily think that, just because the feelings are real doesn't mean the relationship's a good idea, right?
Right. Great. So we've talked about some of these different types of workplace romances. And we talked about kind of how they form, some of the different ingredients that go into making this more likely. Maybe now we turn our attention towards what are some of the impacts that this can have on the individual, on the team, and on the broader organization, because I think that's a really important place to focus upon.
Right. So, yeah, if you're an individual and you're in an office romance, I guarantee your thoughts about going to work each day, if that romance is going well, are are going to be different, right?
That is a big if, right? Yeah. If it's going well.
Ben, you got a spring in your step on the way to work. What's going on?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes it better to go to work probably if there's someone there who you really want to see.
Yeah, and increased motivation, all those good stuff. Culture plays a big part in this. does this organization support these types of relationships or not? So, and when you're so busy at work, it's just nice to meet somebody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've got OkCupid, Tinder, all of that kind of stuff, but the meeting somebody digitally has this kind of different approach than the visceral approach you get when you're able to interact with a variety of people and you are just naturally drawn to somebody, right? So it's great to meet somebody, and that'll impact, how you do at work. Maybe you'll be a little distracted or whatever. But there's also some not so good individual impacts. Sometimes it's nice to just go to work.
Right. It is. Yeah. If you're not looking for that, looking for workplace romance, and other people are, and they're interested in you and they're bothering you, this can really create a problem. If people are pursuing you, or if you are pursuing others and they don't want to be pursued, or you don't want to be pursued, that when it's one-sided, whoa, that can create some problems.
Right. And you just don't expect it. You're sitting here. I know I was doing some work. We were in a team environment. We're working on this project, and I'm operating the mouse, and this girl puts her hand on top of my hand while we're operating the mouse, and I was just like, what? Completely unexpected. First of all, where were these girls for me when I was in high school? Yeah, my high school dating life was, gosh. But anyway, it was just completely unexpected. And then you just think, oh, gosh, well, what, is this? And so I just said, hey, what are you doing? Let's work, okay? And then thankfully that was it. And I'm sure she felt embarrassed because she probably felt there was some signal there or something. But that's the whole thing that's rife in this deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And individuals may not want to be pursued. And let's just be honest about sexual harassment and how unfortunately prevalent it is.
Yeah, yeah. So one piece of data we came across is that, a poll of the largest U.S. service and industrial companies finds that 66% of female vice presidents report that they have been sexually harassed. That's crazy. 2/3.
Right, 2/3. And, this happens to guys as well. We just haven't studied it as much. And it's sexual harassment is baloney. I mean, it is the worst word you can think of. So,
yeah, and it really can be destructive to having a productive work environment. It really can, because it just can really create a lot of tension. It can create just an enormous distraction. It's a bad thing.
It's like chopping your legs off in the company. So, trade shows. The minute I say trade shows, the thing that comes to mind is everybody meeting up in hotel rooms, right? Or outside of the workplace, booze involved, type stuff. But if a sexual harassment incident occurs, it leaves the other person like, how do I work with this person ever again? Right. And it also can diminish other people's views. First of all, the harasser should have the diminished view, right? Let's be honest. But that's not what always happens, because there's this, we're figuring this out as a culture. And when I say figuring it out, there's a lot of people that haven't been educated on how to daggone act in the work.
That's for sure. Or even if they haven't listened, and continue to misbehave. Right. So, I think so we'll talk a little bit more about sexual harassment and what that looks like when we talk about kind of organizational impacts here. But that's certainly, a very important area. Another impact that this may have on individuals is, let's say you have some sort of relationship. People may not like you, right? If you are having a relationship with another person, especially if it's a superior within the organization, they may question the fairness of that situation if you get promoted, or if there's some sort of power type of dynamic there.
Yeah, you're dating the boss, and then ta-da, your career's on a rocket ship. You know, there may be no shenanigans going on, but the people that are competing aren't going to think that, no matter what you tell them, right?
Right. Yeah.
Also, it's if you're not in a relationship around Valentine's Day and everybody else is and talking about it, that's not the best feeling out in your regular life, right?
Right.
But then you're like, finally, I can go to work and be away from this stuff. Oh no, look, everybody else is hooking up.
Yeah.
And I don't have a relationship.
Ugh. Yeah.
So that, when you go to work, you want to build collaborative alliances and work type friends with your peers and a culture and all those stuff. This is like putting a lit stick of dynamite in there. So when relationships dissolve, trust dissolves. There can be reputational damage and retaliation. I'm going to get that person who broke up with me, the jerk,
Mm-hmm.
Sam, take this, or
Right.
Brenda, take that, these kinds of things. So all of this goes in to say, this is why we say, for the love of God, don't do it if you can avoid it.
Right. Yeah. It's a common thing for people to, start to develop romantic relationships at work. But, if we had to fall on, one side or the other, we would say, don't do it. Avoid this. Now, with all that being said, I do know people who, I know people in the military. I know people in civilian roles who have, developed relationships and had extremely, long-term, wonderful relationships that happened originally through meeting at work. It's just something that has to be navigated very carefully, and I think you need to give it some due thought and attention with regard to your behavior at work.
Right. So let's talk about the team impact. So there's this 2008 study by Steelcase. It said 85% of respondents believe that office romance is a workplace distraction, which to me, this is, everything's about evidence-based, playing the odds. If 85% thinks it's a distraction, yet the numbers of people that are engaging in workplace relationships, there's some overlap for the ones that think this is a distraction. Other people that thinks it a bad idea.
Well, maybe they want to be distracted from their work.
The cynicism prevails.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, it's like, hey, this job is horrible, and I would much rather. I mean, I think it's a valid point.
Oh my gosh. Well, we look at this stuff frankly. So because everything, one thing I really hate is like how sterile it is that we talk. I mean, we are real people with hopes, dreams. We live, we die, we have families, all that kind of stuff. We just got to be honest about this stuff. So,
yeah.
Team impacts. One of the things is if you're really trying to get ahead and move ahead, when you're in an office romance, people will start to view you as one person.
Potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, potentially. So when I was in college, we had this guy, great guy, Brian Wooten, and I forget his wife's maiden name at the time, but her name was Audra, and they were so entwined. We called them the Woodra. I actually think he's an Orthodox priest or something now. Really talented guy. But that's that idea, Brangelina, like we talk about these kinds of couples, right?
Somebody's been reading Us Weekly.
Wait a minute. What's Us Weekly?
Oh gosh.
Oh no, Ben.
It's one of those it's one of those magazines about like pop culture and stuff.
How do you even know what that is, Ben?
I saw it once in the supermarket.
Okay. Oh my gosh. So that's that whole idea. If you want to like really move ahead, you risk being viewed as a couple unit rather than an individual contributor. So
now, that being said, it is interesting. So for example, in academia, it's actually fairly common for people who are already a couple to be employed at the same institution. And it's actually considered like, hey, if we want to get this person, we may need to get their spouse too. So there are ways that can be. But I think that one thing that helps in academia is that, it is one reason I like academia is that, you are generally, rated and your performance depends upon your individual contributions, right? Your publications, your teaching, and it keeps things separate, right? So it can work out that way.
And academia is already full of a bunch of weirdos, so weird dynamics, I guess, are kind of the norm, right?
I suppose so, but of course I'm not part of that. I'm not the weirdo,
right? But this back to the couple getting the focus. So they get the focus from both team members, but they generally get the focus from the management. So if you're a manager and like, there's a romance on my team, that starts to suck some attention from the other team members, which those team members can resent. And then also it's kind of a distraction to managers, like managers that aren't careful with handling this, experienced with handling this. They stop providing because they're distracted by making sure, right? And there's always this titillation factor around office romance, which I don't get, but they're not focused on how those other team members are doing or giving feedback and directing that work as well. That's a risk. So that contributes to stuff like perceptions of fairness. Oh, well, not only do these guys have a relationship, the manager's all sucked into that vortex, right?
Right.
And jealousy, around some of that, so that the teams, that's why they say 85% thinks it's a distraction, right? Can't be that good, right? So let's talk about some of the organizational impacts here.
Sure. So this is where things get, I think, particularly dicey, and some things that I think leaders and managers need to be really careful with and be aware of, because these types of relationships can be related to or lead to other types of issues. And in particular, what we're talking about here is the issues related to sexual harassment. And, that, as we already mentioned, can be very destructive in the workplace. So the way I like to think about this is the best organizations are ones that truly help everyone, all of their members, flourish at work. And sexual harassment is a major impediment to that flourishing. And by the way, it's also illegal. You can't do this. This is something that involves both things that people say and things that they do. So it's words and actions. You already mentioned this before, but it's not. I think generally, maybe it's been studied a little bit more, men harassing women, and it probably is true. But it can occur across any combination of genders. If we had to define sexual harassment, this comes from a book that I actually used for one of my HR classes. It's called The Manager's Guide to HR. And I quote, the way that they define it in that is, I quote, "Unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment." So there's a lot going on there. Of course, some key features are that it is of a sexual nature, that it creates this some sort of hostile environment. It interferes with the work environment overall.
Right. So, yeah, there's two general categories on this stuff. And Ben, because you do this in your HR class so well, just keep going.
Yeah. So I'll mention these two general categories. The first one is the quid pro quo. This is that means this for that. And this type of sexual harassment is actually a little bit more clear cut than the second type. But this type of sexual harassment is when the harasser has some sort of authority, some sort of ability to reward or punish. So this is the boss, right? Usually it's someone who has some sort of hierarchical authority over another person, and they attempt to do something or request some sort of favor from a subordinate, and they and of a sexual nature, right? And so an important thing to remember here is, of course, that's sexual harassment, and the employer is liable for those actions of the supervisors, right? Those people with authority, because they are acting as an agent of the organization. So the quid pro quo type, this for that. The second type of sexual harassment is what we call a hostile work environment. And this is a little bit broader, and this is actually a little bit harder to define. There's actually some kind of strategic ambiguity, as I like to call it, in the legal framing of this. But this is where a situation is created at work that is hostile, intimidating, offensive, and it negatively affects someone's ability to do their job. And this is through words, through actions of a sexual nature. This is a little bit more difficult to prove than a quid pro quo case, right? So this is, somebody saying certain jokes, people, staring at other people. This is offensive pictures or other types of things in the workplace. And the key here is that, at least from a legal standpoint, the way this is oftentimes thought about is it must be unwelcome conduct in the eyes of a quote unquote reasonable person. This is kind of the reasonable person standard. It's kind of, we know it when we see it type of thing.
Right. And do you really want to let your future career, your legal status, being sued, all that stuff rest with some court's idea about what a reasonable, there's so much wiggle room there. Just stay far away from this stuff.
Right. And sometimes I have students and I have managers who say, some people are just really easily offended about everything. And
good. Be careful then.
I think that is a response, right? I think it's, be careful. Now, are there cases in which people will, claim some sort of sexual harassment when it's not actually sexual harassment? That can happen. But I think the proactive way to approach this as a leader and a manager is that you should be very careful. And what you want to do, and I think you can approach this from a positive standpoint, right? What you're trying to do is create an inclusive environment in which everybody can do their best and not be worried about non-work related shenanigans. And if you're focused on that, then, I think that'll take care of this other stuff. So both of these categories of sexual harassment, the quid pro quo and the hostile work environment, these can both result in legal action by employees, and they can try to hold the employer culpable, unless the executives took a couple big steps, right? That they, took some sort of strong action to prevent it, or they tried to activate some sort of response plan if something did happen.
Right. So, okay, so let's talk about implications for everybody, individual teams and orgs. So what should we do and not do?
Yeah. So why don't you tackle the first one of, what are some things you should do as like an individual? If you're looking for love, where do you try to do that?
Well, when I was a kid, it's like my aunts, uncles, everybody said, listen, you can't control everything else that happens in the world, but you can control yourself. So this, for you as an individual, this is the front lines of, what you should do or not do. So just daggone avoid it if you can, right? We have meetups, social clubs, get on a nonprofit board, Tinder, OkCupid, all of this. There's every flavor of dating app that you can even think of, right?
Right.
So if you can't help it, though, which is going to happen, right? Make sure you know your company's romance and fraternization policy, or if they require, some of these organizations require a relationship contract of sorts where both people come in, disclose the relationship, sign, we acknowledge we're in a relationship. And I'm not that familiar with the details of those, but, if your company requires it, you should probably check into that, right?
That's right. You definitely should know at least what the policy is. Most organizations who have paid any attention to their HR function have something, usually in their employee handbook or elsewhere, that outlines what this looks like in terms of, fraternization typically is about unduly familiar relationships of a romantic or non-romantic nature, right, between subordinates and superiors. But you got to know the policy, and if something starts to develop, then usually part of that policy is that you have to disclose it to HR so that they can know, and they also try to ensure, pending the policy, right, depending on what the policy is, make sure that you're not in a supervisor-subordinate relationship organizationally.
Things get dicier if there's different levels of power, right? Yeah. So avoid those, right? Especially if you're the one in higher power, you have the ability to just nix all that stuff. It can be flattering, it can be tempting, but it's definitely
Yeah. Well, and the thing is too, and I don't know if this is, I don't know if I'm speaking for, I don't want to speak for women necessarily, but I think men are oftentimes harassers. I think they do it a little bit more. But as you get more senior in an organization, you can lull yourself into thinking that you are, that your jokes are funnier, that you're more attractive than you used to be, right? Because people treat you differently as as you become more powerful in an organization. It's kind of natural for everyone else to put their best face forward to you, and if there is, if you're writing their performance review, they're probably going to be pretty nice to you. And don't get confused with those signals that you may be getting from someone. These are most likely not romantic in nature, and if there's a power differential, that really can create some issues.
Right. So I've seen this where somebody at the director level's falling for somebody that reports to them, and they're maybe looking for a VP promotion. Other people that make that decision look at it and they're like, this person's a risk. Right? What are you doing? That being said, I've seen some people like, hey, listen, we know we have real feelings, so I'm going to quit and go to another company so I can pursue this without being in a direct relationship as far as with their. But if you're Fred in accounting at manufacturer facility number 5 and dating Tim and manufacturing facility number 2, same company, it's a huge company, that could be okay, right?
Well, that's why some organizations, if you are an organization of sufficient size, like this wouldn't work in a 10-person startup, but if you are an organization that has the ability, moving people around so that they are not in any kind of compromising relationship organizationally, if they're involved romantically, that can be an option. And that is oftentimes a step that's taken.
Right. And since we know you won't listen to these, right? I mean, just put yourself in a situation. Your friend comes to you and they say, hey, I'm thinking about dating so-and-so. And you're like, don't do it. It's horrible. It's a bad idea. They do it. There's seldom people that follow advice. Maybe 10%, which still give it because you might reach that 10%. Don't let them walk the plank. But since you won't listen to some of those, avoid it if you can. Don't date over the power differentials. Take it slow. You probably won't listen to that one, but everything that you're going through with somebody needs to be negotiated ethically. The whole thing, safe, sane, consensual, right? Those ideas need to inform how you conduct your workplace romance. And then on a practical level, make sure you keep your texts and emails and stuff with you. So if there's a bad breakup and Bill wants to sabotage Susan or whatever, he might say, hey, she harassed me. But if you're like, wait, that's actually not the case. We've had a relationship for 1.5 years. Here's examples from emails and all that kind of stuff. When you go to court, legal cases have shown that there are different outcomes for individuals who have evidence of some kind of ongoing relationship versus something that could look like, abject harassment when it's taken out of context.
Right. And it's kind of one of those things where you're not thinking about that when things are probably going well in the relationship. But should they go sour, and should one member of that relationship choose to be vindictive about it, you could have a real problem on your hands if they take some of these communications out of context and you don't have an ability to rebut that.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is the thing with all the HR stuff on this. It's completely sterilized, but we know what goes down in the trenches. There's weird pictures, text, all this kind of stuff that happens out. I mean, they're happening in high school, for God's sakes, but like HR people won't talk about them. I don't know why they won't, but we know what it looks like in the, modern day.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you keep some context for that stuff in case you need it. That being said, none of the revenge posting of private stuff, like that's just unbelievably unethical and in a lot of cases prosecutable. So don't be doing that stuff. So, all right, for teams. All right, so you're on a team, somebody has a relationship. Ugh, so annoying, right? But let's talk about how to navigate that, right? Since this stuff's going to happen to you anyway, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of those situations where communication is so important. And, as the leader and manager of that team, people need to be treated the same, regardless of the relationships that are going on in that group. Because the, actual fairness and the perceptions of fairness are really, really important for any kind of trust to develop, for people to be productive when they're working together.
Right. And that's not just the managers that should treat somebody. If the person to your left or right is in a relationship, treat each of those people as individuals. Don't treat them like the Brangelina, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
So, and if you're an individual team member or manager, right, on that team, verbalize if somebody's making you uncomfortable in a supportive, friendly way. You want to be the Debbie. Oh, that's Phil. Phil's mad at our relationship. That's not what you want to do. You want to be like, come on, guys, we're about to start a scrum meeting, and we come into the, conference room, and you're kissing or you're holding hands. What is this, like high school youth group or something? Come in, you're like, come on, guys, that's not what we want at work. Love you, but let's get this team meeting started, right? You don't have to put undue weight, but don't wait until you have a burning resentment against those team members. You're not setting them up for success, and you're not setting yourself up for success.
Yeah. And if there really are problems that are derailing the team's success, I mean, that's where you've got to get some consensus around it. You've got to bring it up together and work through it. And this is going to be a lot easier if you have, from the beginning, treated people fairly, if you've had good communication patterns as a leader and manager. Yeah.
You've set them up for success, and it's still going on. Everybody on the team's annoyed. It's time for a carefrontation. Ann and Bill, all right, everybody thinks this lame. You got to keep this out of the workplace. You just can't do it in a way that's just not, gross and annoying, right? And distracting. So if you try that, right, you talk to them as an individual, you do a carefrontation, probably by the time you step to the carefrontation, you need to start getting management's awareness and support along the way. Hey, listen, we don't want to stop them. We're glad they're living the life they want to live. But, management can kind of get involved. Like, hey, Ann and Bill, the individuals and the teams, I'm kind of paying attention to this too now because it's becoming a broader distraction.
Right. Yeah. And, I think a few other things for teams is, get some support along the way as you need it. If you are the leader or manager, make sure that you are following your own policies that you have in the organization. I think you can support people, right? Because this will happen. It can happen to the best people in your organization. And, we only get one shot at life. So, you don't want to ruin something that could be amazing for these people. But you kind of want to do it in a way that's productive and that doesn't gross people out.
Right. So if you're a team member on that team, support them having their best life, but be like, hey, you need to support me having my best life as somebody who has to work with you sickos, right?
Yeah, I don't want to have to see you either, with big public displays of affection that maybe are inappropriate or whatever else, right?
Right, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about for organizations. If what should they be thinking about from HR and all that kind of stuff?
Right. So, and there's a number of good things in that article by John Pearce that, and we've posted links to these in the show notes so our listeners can check them out. But the first thing is, as an organization, you need to have some sort of policy on office romance, right? You need to clearly define sexual harassment, clearly define what a hostile work environment is, so that people are aware of it. And you got to make sure people are aware. It's not just that it's in the employee handbook and that people usually, when you first get hired, maybe you sign something saying that you read the employee handbook. There probably should be some actual training on these types of topics during orientation, making sure that people actually understand them. And then you also got to follow the policy. So sometimes, an organization maybe has a great policy, but they don't follow their own rules. And that can lead them into hot water as well, because that can be one of the first things that gets looked at when, if there is some sort of legal action that occurs. It's like, hey, do you have a policy? Well, did you follow your own policy? You didn't. Right? That you're stuck,
Totally. Yeah. So, and it's unfortunate that organization. So the minute you bring this up, everybody's like, are we going to get sued? How do we not get sued? What do we got to do? That's great. But this is actually about your broader organization's culture, productivity, and team.
Mm-hmm.
People, taking a legalistic approach tends to be a bummer versus when we talk about enhancing people's flourishing at work. Guys, this isn't about the letter of the law. This is about making the kind of place that the most people can come and thrive at work. These don't have to be like, we can't wait to not get sued type,
Right. Right. I mean, it's kind of the compliance approach versus the engagement approach. Are we going to just be risk averse and have all these policies and rules and so forth, or are we also going to take our focus to making sure that we can have a place where everybody can be their best at work?
Yeah, absolutely. So with that being said, you got to have structural solutions to address the whole perception of fairness stuff. So if, the best way to get promoted around here is get in a relationship with your boss. That's not the culture you want. So let's say there is some kind of romance. Maybe you have, okay, this other person's going to judge that person's promotion, or that manager has a way of recusing themselves from suggesting somebody for promotion type of thing,
Right. And so another important aspect of this is that you really need to have a clearly listed response plan, have some sort of escalation plan in the event that something happens. So what are you going to do if you have, some sort of allegations of sexual harassment? What is the reporting mechanism for that for people? And how are you going to deal with that as an organization? You got to do some contingency planning here.
Right. Clearly listed response plan, great. But none of that stuff really matters unless you've done some training, manager training and organizational training. You need to validate that with legal, conduct that training, keep rosters of, hey, this, so if this manager screws up, it's like, not only is it not in our manual, it's listed that this is unacceptable in our manual. This manager received training on, January 5th, 2020. All of those kinds of things. Which, this is just compliance, but what you don't want to lose an eye on is productivity. So if you're the manager, you're like, okay, I've checked all these boxes, I've done all this stuff. Everybody on my team's in a relationship now, living their best life, but our output's cut in half.
Yeah.
Well, you're not in the right spot there,
Yeah.
You need to keep an eye on productivity and make sure your team's achieving its goals, fulfilling their promises to what they're going to deliver to the organization.
That's right. And then, making sure that you have a data retention and acceptable use policy for company equipment. And this should be something you have anyway. But this is helpful because if something does happen, then oftentimes those are the sources for some of the evidence.
So those are some implications for individuals, teams, and the broader organization. Ben, why don't you give us a review for what we talked about today?
Sure. So today was kind of a fun one. We had a little bit of fun talking about this topic, but it's a very important topic, and this idea of workplace romance. And we talked about these different types of workplace romances, how they form. We talked about some of the different impacts that they can have on people, on teams, on the broader organization. And then we wrapped up with some of these implications, some things that we should do and not do as people, as teams, and as organizations with regard to this entire topic of workplace romance. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.